So far, we have covered the first two chapters of our textbook, and today we're going to move into chapter 3 in crisis communication. This chapter is, again, part of the first few chapters in the book that provide you with some overview of what do we know about effective crisis communication strategies. When you look at the last chapter, chapter 2, you've had an exposure to some major theories, and theories help for us to explain the world, to structure our observations, and to recommend some options. This chapter is looking at what your authors call lessons on effective crisis communication. And these lessons are in part established as part of what we would call best practices by observing the experience of successful organizations and what have we learned by seeing what they have done and accomplished. The interesting thing is that crisis communication keeps evolving year by year, and so the lessons we learn can change. Our advice can change, but these are fairly, at least contemporary lessons that talk about some important issues that relate to a crisis communication response. For example, the first lesson, and I'm not going to go really deep into any of these, read the textbook, but look at the options. Your authors are going to ask you to look at case studies and apply these particular lessons to those case studies. Which of these lessons are relevant observations that account for or help to explain the case study you're looking at? And so you'll see these, I think there are like 10 of them, being applied to case studies in future chapters. For example, the first lesson, determine goals for crisis response. You can't do everything, but most organizations are going to prioritize. What are their options and goals in responding to a crisis? Is it reputation? Is it protecting their employees? Is it retaining a market share? Is it restoring profitability? Is it to take responsibility? Is it to make their products safer? What kinds of changes and what kinds of goals have they set up? By establishing some goals, that helps an organization make decisions. It also helps us later to evaluate their success or failure. Many organizations will take from their goals or will establish goals based on things like their mission statement and their corporate values statement. And so we will see in a few cases, and you might see, how an organization's specific values and mission help them to determine what their goals for their crisis response should be. A second lesson we've learned a lot about is partnering and partnerships. You'll especially see this later in the course, but you really cannot survive a crisis on your own. When a crisis occurs to an organization or a community, all hands are on deck. You need everyone to help. And there are organizations out there specifically designed to help your organization survive and thrive. And so one of the things you have to think about is who can you find and who is out there that provides resources that will help you as an organization to survive a crisis. For example, the federal government deals with disasters all the time, but they can't do it on their own. They don't have the resources. They don't have the equipment. They don't have the talent. They are going to lease and borrow and depend on volunteers and create a system that responds to a crisis, but only with the help of others. So partnering and finding help is really important. The third step in the process and connected to partnership is using what we call stakeholders. Now, stakeholders is a term that is used a lot in business literature as well as public relations literature. Stakeholders are those individuals or institutions that have a stake in, have the capacity to influence the outcome of an organization, both positively or negatively. They are not stockholders. They're not simply the people who've invested money in the company. But there are people who are capable of impacting the direction and the success or failure of your efforts. The media is one of them, and your textbook talks about them as part of your stakeholder pool, and your textbook also talks about primary and secondary stakeholders. There are people who are directly tied to your organization you need to respond to, and there are people who are going to sit back and observe and watch, but will still have an opinion and will still make decisions that will impact your success or failure. So do that as well. The fourth lesson is to develop strong primary and secondary stakeholder relationships. What we know about most crises is that if you are well established in the community, if you have established a good connection with various populations prior to the crisis, you can not only survive the crisis more effectively, but they will also support you. So one of our challenges and goals in a study of a crisis communication situation is to identify all of our potential stakeholders. I don't just mean customers. I mean employees, neighbors, the media, your competition. Who are all the different people who will be impacted by your crisis, and how should you respond to them? And so looking at stakeholders and developing good prior relationships will make it possible that when you have a crisis, there are people there who know you, support you, and will help you get through it. One stakeholder group that I want to mention a little more detail that your textbook does some, but we'll talk about again later too, is what we call underrepresented populations. The federal government, FEMA, has a whole list of what they call at-risk or underrepresented populations. For example, when we looked at Hurricane Katrina years ago, disasters like that, fatalities are most high in ethnic minorities, people with poverty, the elderly. A majority of victims, for example, in Hurricane Katrina were African American. They didn't have the resources to leave. They didn't have access to transportation out of the region. They weren't necessarily given the appropriate information they needed to make a decision about whether to stay or leave. Poverty, access to information, leaves some populations that are much more threatened and endangered by a crisis. We've seen examples of elderly, for example, in nursing homes abandoned by their caretakers, people who have drowned and have died because they didn't have the resources necessary to remove themselves from a dangerous place or to make good decisions. We know as a result that sometimes we need to think about different messaging strategies, different ways to connect with people who are threatened by crisis. For example, from Katrina onward, one of the interesting things they learned is pet owners are sometimes in greater danger of being hurt because a lot of pet owners will not leave their pets behind. They refuse to, let's say, abandon their home or evacuate if they don't have a way to get their cats or dogs or horses or chickens or whatever animal to safety. And people have actually made decisions to try and ride out hurricanes and tornadoes and flooding and storms because they are not willing to let their animals alone. Since Katrina, the federal government has actually made an effort to open up more shelters to animals as well as their owners, because if people are not willing to evacuate their homes, they're putting themselves and first responders at risk. So we have learned that different audiences, different stakeholders have different needs and requirements and messages. And it sounds kind of trite to say that a pet owner is someone like that, but we have to address everybody's needs and think about what is going to impact how people will respond and quickly respond to a crisis. Other lessons we've learned in the past include things like feedback. We need to listen to stakeholders. We need a system in place that's dynamic enough to get feedback from audiences so we know what they need and want. Crisis communication cannot be simply downward and one-directed. There has to be some inclusion of members of the community. The challenge of a crisis for organizations is usually people want answers well before the answers are all available. In most cases, you cannot pinpoint the reason for a plane crash or a building breakdown or poisoning situation, from the very moment you hear about it. So one of the challenges we have is that you need to think about, and the lesson is described as communicating early, accepting uncertainty, assuring the public of continued contact. So communication quickly, because if you don't communicate about your crisis, someone else will. The media will go anywhere they can have a voice and get a voice. If you refuse to interact and engage the media in your crisis, someone else who you have no control over will decide to do it for you. So you need to respond quickly. You need to take control of the communication environment. You need to accept the fact that you don't know everything and to actually admit to people that that information is forthcoming, or we are still studying the cause or effect of a crisis, that we are trying to figure this out. We are going to need time or research or resources in order to identify who's to blame. So accept the uncertainty and don't make you don't want to overpromise people. And if you're not responsible for the actual crisis, explain who is responsible. You need to take responsibility for the outcome, even if you're not responsible for the cause. So we know from our lessons that communicating quickly is necessary. People expect it, and we need to respond effectively to the right audiences. So some other lessons that fall into place along those lines I've kind of already mentioned. Try not to be too absolute or uncertain. It's hard to backtrack or change your story. People do not appreciate it when your story changes. So as you're looking for new information, provide the details you can. Identify those issues they need more information for, and provide an opportunity to get that information to people. You don't want to overassure or minimize the impact of a crisis. If you are not willing to admit that there's a danger and they make people think carefully about a possible crisis, they will, again, minimize their threat and therefore place themselves in danger. Do not minimize or overassure people that everything is going to be fine. Give public some useful information about what to do. We call this efficacy. Tell people how they can respond. What should they do with their home, with their animal, with evacuation? Help people make some good decisions, safe decisions. People who are busy with something to do are more likely to find an understanding of the crisis and be responsible for it. The other thing to acknowledge is, yes, that positive things can happen. Heroes are born. Change is created. People are changed. Newer warning systems evolve. New competitive opportunities are created. Take a look at some of those as well. So there are a series of 10 lessons in this chapter. You'll be applying them to later case studies. You can use them in your paper assignments for class. Think about what we know about good practice and apply that to our situations. Finally, I want to emphasize a little bit about social media. Social media has become an important and critical component to crisis communication. Organizations need to learn to monitor their channels of social media. Ideally, to also prevent a crisis. There are some companies that simply don't pay attention to complaints, and then they're surprised when something goes wrong. A social media crisis is something that does not have to happen. In today's world, we go where our audience is, and social media channels have become the way or the source for reaching many audiences. There are apps involved by the Red Cross and other agencies to do so. A lot of communities now are using social media apps to directly converse with audiences and stakeholders. So if that's where your audience can be found, that's where you need to communicate. There are a couple of resources I'd like you to look at online in this chapter. There's a little discussion by Dr. Tim Coombs about social media and understanding their importance. There's also been an evolving growth of what we call Social Media Crisis Center. There's a link in the slides to the Red Cross, but there have been a number of groups now that are using sort of a command center approach to coordinating information about a crisis so they can then push it back out to the groups or organizations experiencing them. They are really neat facilities, and there are other places you can look for what we call social media centers or command centers or crisis centers. And if you want to learn more about the phenomenon, take a look at it. They're kind of fascinating. So we've covered Chapter 3. We're looking at best practices. You've had an experience defining a crisis, identifying those theories that are relevant to crisis studies, and also to think about the best practices that have occurred. You're ready now to start looking at those case studies and start learning about examples of crises as they've happened and the choices made for better, for worse, and how they could be more successfully approached and impacted in the future. See you with Chapter 4. Have a good week.